Chapter 9. Of the signs by which it will be known that the spiritual person is walking along the way of this night and purgation of sense. But since these aridities might frequently proceed not from the night and purgation of the sensual desires aforementioned, but from sins and imperfections, or from weakness and lukewarmness, or from some bad humor or indisposition of the body, I shall here set down certain signs by which it may be known if such aridity proceeds from the aforementioned purgation, or if it arises from any of the aforementioned sins. For the making of this distinction, I find that there are three principal signs. The first is whether, when a soul finds no pleasure or consolation in the things of God, it also fails to find it in anything created. For as God sets the soul in this dark night, to the end that he may quench and purge its sensual desire, he does not allow it to find attraction or sweetness in anything whatsoever. In such a case, it may be considered very probable that this aridity and insipidity do not proceed from recently committed sins or imperfections. For if this were so, the soul would feel in its nature some inclination or desire to taste other things than those of God, since whenever the desire is allowed indulgence in any imperfection, or it immediately feels inclined thereto, whether little or much, in proportion to the pleasure and the love that it has put into it. Since, however, this lack of enjoyment in things above or below might proceed from some indisposition or melancholy humor, which oftentimes makes it impossible for the soul to take pleasure in anything, it becomes necessary to apply the second sign and condition. The second sign, whereby a man may believe himself to be experiencing the said purgatory, is that the memory is ordinarily centered upon God, with painful care and solicitude, thinking that it is not serving God, but it is backsliding, because it finds itself without sweetness in the things of God. And in such a case it is evident that this lack of sweetness and this aridity come not from weakness and lukewarmness, for it is the nature of lukewarmness not to care much, or to have any inward solicitude for the things of God. There is thus a great difference between aridity and lukewarmness. For lukewarmness consists in great weakness and remissness, in the will and in the spirit, without solicitude as to serving God, whereas purgative aridity is ordinarily accompanied by solicitude, with care and grief, as I say, because the soul is not serving God. And although this may sometimes be increased by melancholy or some other humor, as it frequently is, it fails not for that reason to produce a purgative effect upon the desire, since the desire is deprived of all pleasure and has its care centered upon God alone. For when mere humor is the cause, it spends itself in displeasure and ruin of the physical nature, and there are none of those desires to serve God which belong to purgative aridity. When the cause is aridity, it is true that the sensual part of the soul has fallen low, and is weak and feeble in its actions, by reason of the little pleasure which it finds in them. But the spirit, on the other hand, is ready and strong. For the cause of this aridity is that God transfers to the spirit the good things and the strength of the senses, which, since the soul's natural strength and senses are incapable of using them, remain barren, dry, and empty. For the sensual part of a man has no capacity for that which is pure spirit. And thus, when it is the spirit that receives the pleasure, the flesh is left without savor, and is too weak to perform any action. But the spirit, which all the time is being fed, goes forward in strength, and with more alertness and solicitude than before in its anxiety not to fail God. And if it is not immediately conscious of spiritual sweetness and delight, but only of aridity and lack of sweetness, the reason for this is the strangeness of the exchange. For its palate has been accustomed to those other sensual pleasures upon which its eyes are still fixed, and since the spiritual palate is not made ready or purged for such subtle pleasure, until it finds itself becoming prepared for it by means of this arid and dark night, it cannot experience spiritual pleasure and good, but only aridity and lack of sweetness, since it misses the pleasure which aforetime it enjoyed so readily. These souls, whom God is beginning to lead through these solitary places of the wilderness, are like to the children of Israel, to whom in the wilderness God began to give food from heaven, containing within itself all sweetness. And, as is there said, it turned to the savor which each one of them desired. But withal the children of Israel felt the lack of the pleasures and delights of the flesh, and the onions which they had eaten aforetime in Egypt, the more so because their palate was accustomed to these, and took delight in them, rather than in the delicate sweetness of the angelic manna. And they wept and sighed for the flesh pots, even in the midst of the food of heaven. To such depths does the vile